Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to talk about the dreaded bank balance sheets. Okay, full disclosure, I despise bank balance sheets, okay? Because the AP exam for macro, which is where you would see these, can do a lot with bank balance sheets. And the problem is they can ask very similar questions that have vastly different answers. And so this is something where I'm going to show you what one is and how you read it, but I'm going to provide you with practice outside of this video. We're going to practice a lot with these bank balance sheets. But in this video, I'm just going to show you what it is and how you read it. But that's basically it, to be clear. We will do a lot of practice with this. Be patient. Give yourself as many opportunities to practice as possible. Ask questions. They're nasty. They just are. Some students love them, but I personally find them annoying as all get out. But we're going to get through it together. So let's talk about bank balance sheets. So here's an example of a bank balance sheet. A bank balance sheet shows a bank's assets and liabilities, and you're always going to see it in a table like this. So let's go through and talk about what you see here. And before we start, on the AP exam, the bank balance sheets you're given may not look exactly like this. Now, this one is from an AP question, but they may look slightly different, but the key parts are always going to be the same. Okay, so don't freak out by that. So we start here with a familiar word, assets, right? We said that's anything that's tangible or non-tangible that has value. Here we're going to be a little more specific as far as banks go. This is anything that a bank owns. Capital letters here. Anything a bank owns, that is an asset. Okay, and we'll talk about what these assets are in a second. So this is stuff the bank owns, they control it in that column. On the other side, what we see are a bank's liabilities. And these are things that a bank owes to others. It's not theirs. They're holding on to it, but it belongs to someone else. And so banks are very cautious about their liabilities because they are liable for it. They owe these things to others, okay? So let's take care of the liability side first because there's not a whole lot there. The first one are demand deposits. And so demand deposits, we can go ahead. Let's do a different color here. So we'll go ahead and put demand deposits up here. This is money put into checking accounts, right? So, the average person on the street, they go to their bank, they deposit some money. That's demand deposits. And so this bank has $10,000 worth of demand deposits. Now, why is this a liability? Because the bank owes this money to the depositors, right? If Bob, Linda, whoever comes calling for their money, the bank owes them that money. The bank has to provide them with their money. So it's a liability. Another one you see here is what we call owner's equity. And I'm putting the letters NA for not applicable, which basically means you don't really need to worry about this. I would not make a note of this other than to say owner's equity is simply what the owner of the bank is putting into the bank himself or herself. And so the bank owes the owner that money if the owner would come calling, asking for that money back. Not a big deal, but sometimes you see it here. Now, why do you see it here? Because both sides of a bank balance sheet have to, balance, right? So if you have $20,000 in liabilities, you better also have $20,000 in assets. And if you add up both sides, you will see that it's $20,000 of assets and $20,000 of liabilities. Both sides of the balance sheet have to balance. They have to equal each other at all times. So if you take something away from one side, you're going to have to add it to the other side, or subtract it from both sides, add to both sides. Whatever the case may be, you always got to make sure it stays in balance. All right, with that in mind, let's start diving into the asset side a little bit here. So the first thing we see here are required reserves. and this is money to meet reserve requirement. Okay, so basically the bank is saying, okay, we have to keep $2,000 in required reserve. That is the money we have put aside to meet the reserve requirement exactly. And so a question that AP might ask, and I'm sure they probably asked it here, is what is the reserve requirement? What percent is the reserve requirement? I'm not going to tell you the answer, but I'm going to give you a hint and see if you can figure it out on your own. So we see $2,000 is what percent of 10,000, right? Because the reserve requirement is a percent of deposits. So we're saying, the bank is saying here, that in order to meet the reserve requirement, they had to put $2,000 of that 10,000 into required reserves to meet the reserve requirement. Remember, this is fractional reserve banking. We don't want a bank run on our hands. So just a little hint there to figure that out. Next up, we've got excess reserves, and this is money a bank holds but doesn't have to. Okay? So this bank's choosing to loan everything out, right? There's nothing that this bank is holding on to that it doesn't have to, right? Some banks do, and some questions you'll see with bank balance sheets, sometimes there will be an amount of money that is an excess reserve, but here it's nothing. So the bank is either saying, okay, the bank is basically saying, we're only going to meet the bare minimum requirement of what we have to hold in reserve, and we're loaning out the rest. Let's try to make as much money as we can. We're going to loan out the rest. Okay? And so you can see that's exactly what they've done, because customer loans are $8,000. So of this demand deposits, 2,000 of it is in required reserves, and the rest of it is being loaned out to customers. And then we've got bonds, government securities. This is $7,000. So this is an asset to the bank because the government is borrowing money from this bank, and it's $7,000 worth of government securities. And then building and fixtures is basically the value of the property on which the bank operates. I will tell you, this one here will never matter. This one with the government securities could potentially matter down the road, but we're not ready for that yet. I will bring up the idea of bonds when we need to know that, but for now, just don't worry about that. The key numbers we need to be paying attention to in every bank balance sheet as of right now are required reserves, excess reserves, customer loans, demand deposits. Anytime you see a bank balance sheet, that's where you want to start, is with those values, right? Honestly, the first question I ask myself when I see a bank balance sheet is, where are my required reserves and what's the reserve requirement, right? And so I'll go ahead and give it to you that it is 20%, right? 2,000 of 10,000 is 20%. So they have to keep 20% in required reserves, and then they can loan out the other 80%, right? Because 2,000 is 20% of $10,000. So hopefully you were able to get that value there. So my caution to you as we wrap up this video is, first of all, make sure you understand the vocabulary, understand the terminology. I'm going to give you a ton of practice with bank balance sheets and the stuff they can ask you with this, because you could also be thinking about, okay, what's the multiplier, right? We know that the reserve requirement is 20%. What's the multiplier? There's a lot of things they can ask with this, believe it or not. And the only way to get good at it is to see a lot of different examples, to see all the different stuff they can ask you. And that's what we'll do. And that's all for this video on bank balance sheets. Until next time, have a great day.